Throughout the semester, we've learned about the lives and some of the great works of two of the greatest directors of the 20th century, Steven Spielberg and George Lucas. We've learned much about Steven Spielberg's childhood, including his strained relationship with his father, which influences much of his work and ends up being an underlying theme in his movies. As for George Lucas, we learned about his childhood and how he had to make that leap into the film industry and not follow into his father's footsteps of owning a store. Though prior to their collaboration, they were colleagues, they had never worked in a professional sense and actually combining their creative abilities together. This all changed in 1981 with the release of Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Released in the summer of 1981, produced by Frank Marshall, Paramount Pictures, and Lucasfilms, distributed by Paramount Pictures. Starting with the cast, this film did not originally plan for Harrison Ford to play the role of Indiana. In fact, Tom Selleck was heavily considered for this film. There are even several scenes of Tom Selleck playing the role of Indiana as seen here in this screenshot. When Harrison Ford was mentioned for the role of Indiana, pushback came from George Lucas, who had previously worked with Harrison Ford, and wanted to avoid the sense that this actor was tied to him directly in the same way that De Niro was tied to Scorsese. Ford got the role nevertheless, as Selleck had to go work on Magnum P.I. Even some smaller roles were not played by the original actor that was in mind. Take Salah, who was played by John Davies. He was originally supposed to be played by Danny DeVito, believe it or not, something that's personally kind of wild to me. Smaller roles played by known actors include Satipo, who is played by Alfred Molina, who many of us know from Frida and Spider-Man 2. I always wondered how the idea of Indiana Jones ever came about, like how the idea of this character was ever conceived. And as it turns out, George Lucas and Steven Spielberg drew a lot of inspiration from what are called 1930s serials. Now, prior to this, I had never heard of serials. I didn't really understand what it was. As it turns out, they are probably what we nowadays call a mini-series. They're kind of films or long-running movies that have many chapters. Iconic scenes of Raiders of the Lost Ark include the scene at the beginning of the film where Indy is being chased by the giant boulder as he escapes the cave. In fact, though this wasn't obviously a actual boulder, it still weighed a lot. It was about 12 feet tall, anywhere from 3 to 800 pounds, and it really was chasing after Harrison Ford, and they had to shoot a total of 10 scenes. This quote from Spielberg really exemplifies how big of a stunt it was on Harrison's part. Quote, "The Rock was more effective chasing Harrison with Harrison running towards the camera. It just didn't work well having him doubled. A doubled would have cheated his head down. So Harrison volunteered to do it himself. He succeeded. There were 5 shots of The Rock from 5 different angles. Each done separately, each done twice. So Harrison had to race The Rock 10 times. He won 10 times and beat the odds. He was lucky, and I was an idiot for letting him try." Lastly, who could forget one of the most iconic villain death scenes with the death of Major Arnold Todd at the end of the film, where his face just completely melts off. What looks like a couple seconds was actually filmed over the course of 10 minutes using a gelatin mold and a series of heat lamps. Overall, Raiders of the Lost Ark was an incredible collaboration between Lucas and Spielberg. This really cemented them as the film industry's greatest of their era.